Hello and welcome. We're about to have a conversation with Gary Kenton. He is the author of Transmissions and Transgressions, History of Rock and Roll and Television, its impact on society, and its reflection of society itself and culture. A little bit about Gary is that he has a BA in Special Ed, a Master's in Communication, for which this book is his thesis, his master's thesis. He's served on the Soil and Water Conservation for Greensboro. He's been on the District and Planning Boards for Guilford County, and he is on the Board of Directors for the League of Women Voters. So please join us as we have a conversation about his book, Transmissions and Transgressions. So, Transmissions and Transgression, the history of rock and roll and television. Tell me about how this book came about.
Well, I'll just start. When the Beatles hit in 1964, I was 14 years old. I was the perfect age for that explosion. So I was a Beatles, baby, and I came along with them. All right. So television. My sister's a little older, so when Elvis was on the Ed Sullivan Show, big event. And then when the Beatles were on the Ed Sullivan Show, it was a big event. So to me, so rock and roll was just really important to me. So there's this one way of telling this story, which is just, here's rock and roll that appeared on television. And I try to tell that history, and I have an appendix. I try to have an appendix of every rock and roll show that appeared on television, at least up through the MTV era. But the other element is to look at it as from the way I learned in school, getting my master's degree, is that television is a certain technology with certain properties, and rock and roll can be also seen as a medium, or certainly can be looked at as a technological entity. And these two entities clash. So that's the second story I try to tell in my book, that rock and roll wasn't going to work on television. And so there was this struggle from the beginning between this music, this sound. It was generational, but it was also just a technological. Rock and roll sounded terrible on TV. You couldn't capture what was going on in rock and roll on television. There were shows that tried. And my favorite shows were the ones before American Bandstand went national. The two big revolutions were American Bandstand and then later MTV that changed rock and roll and television. But the American Bandstand was the first one.
And MTV itself changed entirely came into a whole new culture.
That's right. It became reality TV. For a while, there was not much rock and roll on MTV. Come back a little,
so the interesting thing about this is you're talking about, at least the way I view it, is rock and roll and television and their clash, but their impact on culture, or their reflection of culture. Because we talked about the news and record before the program, we talked about the news and record, and I kind of see that in the same way, is that their reflection, they're either influencing culture or they're reflecting culture.
Both, absolutely. All these things are just products of the culture. You can't have any of these things. That's where they come out of. People who make TV shows that's the waters they swim in, can only be in their culture. But then once you put out any kind of product like that, it has an influence on the culture. So this, my friend of mine is an expert on situation comedies. It's a great area to study because they're a unique product of American culture, but oftentimes when a culture is changing, the first little hit you see is on a situation comedy. A single woman living by herself. It wasn't, Mary Tyler Moore wasn't a feminist track, but that was an important thing to show this vibrant woman living by herself and dating on a situation comedy. So anyway, I think rock and roll has acted, television certainly. Difference with television was television went from being new to being dominant in a very short time. Radio had to change. And so it happened very quickly. And that's part of why the relationship of rock and roll was the way it is, that television was still pretty new. Television was dominant, but it wasn't sure of itself. So when there was this conservative backlash against rock and roll, television got very worried. So television really joined. In my book, I use the phrase rockophobia, which was all these churches were railing against rock and roll, and they were burning records and so on. And television was afraid to embrace it. Now, they wanted to reach young kids, but they wanted to do it in a safe way. And so they were, a lot of the most interesting shows were local shows where they wanted to reach the kids. So they did something and they grabbed some DJ or someone who looked reasonably well on television. Said, okay, you got your show. And there were no rules. No one knew what they were doing. And there was some great, fun for a while. But then the network, the ABC, they got Dick Clark. And Dick Clark's job was to make rock and roll safe for television. So Chuck Berry disappears for the most part, Bo Diddley disappears, Jerry Lee Lewis disappears, and you get Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello and Fabian. You get a made-for-television version of rock and roll.
Yeah, and you know what was so funny is you talked about how it kind of adapted over time, and one of the things I thought was interesting was you brought up when people bought records, they wanted to hear the same thing they hear on television. They wanted to assimilate with that.
Right.
You brought up that it didn't go so well the first couple times that they did that. I'm thinking of the lip syncing that happened and some of the tragic events there that happened.
Yeah, some of them were pretty funny. I mean, funny now wasn't funny to the artist at the time when artists are in the middle of their song and the music stops and they're lip syncing, or there's a skip in the record, or something. Well, lip syncing, the first time Dick Clark asked Chuck Berry to lip sync, and he said, I didn't come here to fake my songs. But then Chuck Berry learned what television was, and he adopted and realized that was the way it was going to have to be done for it to be professional. So he went along with it. But it is an artificial thing. When, the next generation, John Lennon refused to do a lot on TV, and he said, because it's fake. It's just not real. So for someone for whom authenticity, and that's rock and roll is based on authenticity, at least for most of the fans, television was an inherently fake version of the thing that they loved for its unfakeness. But now, did we watch? Oh yeah, especially those early days when there wasn't that much. When we heard that the Rolling Stones were going to be on Ed Sullivan, or any of these groups they were going to have some show with these groups, oh yeah, we were glued. But it was, I think, the artists, and I go into this in the book, the artists had to sort of make a decision. What was their stance going to be? Were they going to go on TV and just, we're grateful for this opportunity, look at the audience we're reaching, we're happy to be here? But did they sort of wink at their audience like, look, we know this is weird, we know this is fake, we know this is staged, we know the sound is terrible, that this tinny sound. It's only in the recent years we've had home, people can have their little home theaters with great sound, so the sound was terrible. So there was sort of I don't know, no one ever said it, but there was sort of an agreement between the fans and the artists that they would do this for what it was, but this wasn't real. This wasn't rock and roll as it was supposed to be.
So, and you worked in the industry too for a little while, didn't you? Tell me about your work in the rock and roll industry. Music. Well,
I was in college, and one of my professors was the co-editor of a rock and roll magazine. The name was Fusion. No one now has heard about it, but it was an early rock and roll magazine that treated rock and roll pretty seriously. So before I really knew much about it, there I was working for this magazine, and I became the review editor. So I was assigning record reviews and writing record reviews. So that's how but like I said, I was already a fan of the music. The music was important to me, but I got tossed into this magazine. So it was was great. I got to know all these people writing about rock and roll all over the country, and rock critics at that time were a unique bunch. So had interesting experiences, but I was just doing record reviews. That was my bailiwick, but I got to talk to a lot of writers who were thinking about rock, who were thinking about what this phenomenon was and where it was going. And by this time, this is the late 60s and early 70s, that first generation of rock and rollers is beginning to age out. So it was a change, but that sort of, I started taking notes about rock and roll on TV then, like the early 70s is when it occurred to me that this was a topic that not too many other people were covering. So it only took me 40 years to do the book.
And the book is, as a matter of fact, it is your thesis, if you will, right?
I went to Fordham University and I was very fortunate. Marshall McLuhan, who, great icon of media studies, went to Fordham for a while. When he became famous, he came to New York and he was at Fordham. So I got to study under people who studied directly under Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman. Neil Postman, one of the great scholars of TV, wrote the book Amusing Ourselves to Death about television, and he didn't, of course, know anything about Donald Trump, but everything Neil Postman and Marshall McLuhan said almost completely predicts what we've gone through in media since. So that's the group of scholars I fell in with, and I drank the Kool-Aid. It's called media ecology, and the basic idea is that every medium, every communication technology creates its own environment. So McLuhan's great statement was the medium is the message, meaning that in addition to the content of the medium, there is the medium itself having an impact on you. And so when you're watching television is impacting you. It doesn't matter whether you're watching a movie or the news or situation comedy, you're still watching television. And the process of television is impacting your brain. And now we have MRI imaging that shows this. Your brain is different watching television than it is reading a book. It changes the way our brain works. And if you do one thing over and over again, it will change your brain significantly. So that's the group I fell in with, and I just took to it and started applying it to a lot of the world, but started applying it to what I was already thinking about rock and roll and television.
And you mentioned the impact that even a situation comedy had. This reminds me of Norman Lear and all of the shows he had done, All in the Family and Jeffersons.
Right, and one of the lessons of All in the Family is that we know Norman Lear to be a liberal person. He started liberal organizations, and most of us who were watching that show assumed that we knew what the intention was, that Archie Bunker was a bigoted, conservative guy, a racist. But a lot of people watched that show and came away with a completely different message. They embraced Archie Bunker. They embraced Archie Bunker much in the way many people today embrace Donald Trump. Finally, someone who is expressing what I'm thinking, and someone who's finally willing to push back against this liberal political correctness. So Norman Lear was surprised, and a lot of his audience, people like me, were surprised when we saw the data that showed that there was a whole other audience for that show that was interpreting it in a completely different way.
And apparently they never got to the end of the episode where Archie Bunker inevitably ends up looking like a doofus.
That's right. But they always, because of Edith, the other characters, Edith, his wife, they never made him hateful. And because, O'Connor, I'm forgetting his first name, was a great actor. People don't realize, he had a long acting career before he was Archie Bunker.
Carol O'Connor,
right. But they always, they didn't demonize Archie. even though he was foolish, and he was made to look foolish by events and by his son-in-law, Rob Reiner, and battled with his own daughter and so on. But it was never, he was never a non-person. He was never, the family stayed together. Mm-hmm. And I think, so in today's world, that would be the lesson that President-elect Biden might be saying, okay, we can have our arguments and we can have it, but in the end, we gotta find the common ground somewhere.
It was a very interesting show, and in that way, it's like, I think Norman Lear understood the impact of what television was having, right. And saying, it's like you're all of a sudden you're watching a sitcom and oh haha this is funny, and then it's like bam, you're hit with, oh wait a minute, this ain't just, right. If you're paying attention enough anyway, you're just like, oh, right. This isn't just a show anymore. This is, right. We're really doing something here.
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting now, again, talking about political correctness, which to me is one way of looking at political correctness. We've learned to be more considerate of the things we say. Oh, well, whose feelings may be hurt if I say such a thing? I don't think that's a bad thing. Now, can it go too far where you're sort of saying, well, certain subjects are taboo and we won't mention that? Yeah, it can go too far. But I do think that show now, you couldn't put that show on today. You couldn't write those scripts today because things were said that were pretty outrageous. So I think there was a benefit to that. Now, so thank goodness we have comedians, we have the internet, we have other platforms where that political correctness can be abandoned. Hopefully still under control. See, that's one of the problems with the internet, is that there are places where they abandon political correctness, but they also abandon facts. They also abandon any kind of honest debate or any consideration of another point of view. I think comedians are really important, because I think comedians are, they're honest brokers. Not all of them, but a guy like Dave Chappelle is open to other influences. It's in some way it's just the competition between the comedians. I think they want to, in terms of, no, I'm more honest than you. I see the world more clearly than you. So there's this incredibly beneficial competition going on there, for who's more with the zeitgeist and who's seeing things more clearly. The comedians are often leading us. They're the first ones to say certain things.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting you say that. I'm thinking about as we're talking here, comedians and the impact they have on politics or social issues or anything of that nature, right, is actually huge. Dave Chappelle has a huge following, a huge impact. And you think about, after watching the nightly news or whatever, well, it's kind of going the way of the dodo bird as we speak, right, with the internet taking over. But you think about Jay Leno or David Letterman, right, when they were on, you kind of got to laugh about how crazy this world was that we're living in.
Right. And then you went to, Jon Stewart and all the people who came after him, and it's an interesting. But again, I'll go back to rock and roll. Rock and roll also served some of that same function of, it was an important political force. Now, most of it was not political at all. A lot of my favorite music is doo-wop. My favorite song ever, maybe Papa Ooh Mau Mau. It's just me and my granddaughter sing it. That has no meaning at all. It's just pure joyfulness. But rock and roll, with the beat, with rhythm and blues before it, and then as rock and roll. First of all, rock and roll is a blend of black and white from the beginning. That's one of the reasons that there was such a backlash against it. That rock and roll inherently is a mixture of black and white culture. So from the very beginning, the southern United States, people I know who grew up down here did not hear all the rock and roll I did, because the radio wasn't playing it, and the TV certainly wasn't showing it. So rock and roll itself was a subversive element just in its very existence. So even when the content was completely apolitical, it was still an important political force. And then with the Beatles and others, of course, Bob Dylan, you start getting it being more political. There's actual content there.
And Bob Dylan always said he was never political. He was never trying to tell a message. He was just trying to write a song.
That's right. Well, he's an enigma and remains so, and but his early stuff was, powerfully political, and some of his songs were absolutely topical, writing about certain incidents. But then even his
The Hurricane.
right, and Hattie Carroll, stuff from his first couple of records. But even his more, my favorite Bob Dylan records are not over. Blonde on Blonde, Highway 61, that stuff. Even he, in interviews, marvels at how those songs were written. I think he was taking a lot of drugs in that time. He was part of the time. Even Bob Dylan isn't going to write those Bob Dylan songs anymore. But even those were, again, political in form, if not in content. That the very energy of, when he went electric, this was, considered revolutionary, that he was a folk singer and the folk community embraced him, and then he plugged in at the Newport Festival. And there was a story, which from what I gather, I actually talked to Pete Seeger about this, where there was a story was that Pete Seeger was outraged and took an axe and tried to break the cables backstage so that Bob Dylan wouldn't have power to be electric. And that's not true, but the idea was there, that there are people who thought Bob Dylan betrayed them by going electric.
And the story I know from that was that Bob Dylan, people started booing.
Right.
And he turned around to his band and he said, "Play it louder."
Right. And there's a great documentary of their tour, and it's him with the band, this great group of musicians going on tour in Europe. And it was a real mixture of fans and booing, and it was an intense moment. But it was, to me, the music he was making at that time was still, if you're asking me that desert island question about what records am I taking with me on the desert island, that Bob Dylan from that era would be stuff I'd have to take.
Well, since you brought it up, what couple records would take you on the desert island if you had nothing else?
Well, it's funny because I think music, and I think mostly the music that's most important to us is the stuff we heard at a certain age. I think that's pretty much true for everybody. It doesn't mean we stop listening to new music or stop appreciating new things. I know my horizons have been broadened, but to me, hip hop today is what rock and roll was then. Hip hop is inherently political, even if it's just gangster rap and people are, not talking about politics. It's inherently there. But rap doesn't, and hip hop doesn't speak to me the way, so I would not have hip hop record with me on my desert island, which, I would have probably Rubber Soul, Beatles. I would probably have, Blonde on Blonde, Bob Dylan. It's nice, that's a double record. I guess I can take 2 in 1 there. I would have one of the Kinks records to me. If there's a figure in the rock and roll era that was sort of like George Gershwin or Cole Porter, to me, Ray Davies of the Kinks is that figure. Just heartbreaking stuff. And the Rolling Stones, I think, in a weird way, I think Mick Jagger is underrated as a songwriter, and he and Keith Richards together, songwriters, and what they've created has also been very political in its own way, even though it's often very sexist, and but it's much more rooted in blues and R&B than the Beatles went on and took us out into psychedelia and so on. But I'd probably have Aftermath, Rolling Stones, maybe. But anyway, you get the picture. All the stuff I'm picking is pretty much late 60s, early 70s. So that's when I was in the throes of it. And I had, if you can imagine, a Jufro, what we call a Jufro, with like curly hair, and it went out to a certain extent. Some women thought that was cute. Now looking back at pictures of myself, I'm not so sure. I wore bell bottoms. Now I can't explain it, you know. It was just so I was as much a victim of fashion and so on as anybody.
It was the culture.
It was the culture, and showing, identifying. You know, there was a big. When I first went to college at Boston University, they had the hippies all over campus, and I was put in a place right where my window literally looked out on the football field, and there was quite a bit of harassment. I never got beaten up or anything like that, but it was the jocks and the hippies were really at each other. So the university, after a couple of weeks, moved all the hippies down into one dorm and let all the jocks be up at the other dorm, and that pretty much ended the problem. So I was in this dorm that, you know, was a lot of stuff going on, and but at the same time, anyway, college was. I became a student I was an indifferent student in high school, but I loved everything about college. And it was 68, so the anti-war movement. I was invested in the anti-war movement. I was draftable age, so I was invested in that movement, and it was great. Unlike kids today who have to choose between their political life and their social life and their entertainment, it was all the same. I was out on the street. I was political, and the music bands were plugging in and playing out on the street, and I was meeting girls there. It was great.
It was a very interesting time of movement going on.
Yeah.
What were some of the most? We talked about your favorite records. What were some of the most? I guess it would be probably in that same category. What was some of the more influential music of that time that kind of pushed people in that direction?
Well, I don't know. I guess you'd look at the charts. I mean, you know, clearly the Beatles had an overwhelming influence, even on all the other groups I mentioned, and the Beach Boys, just in terms of the sound. In other words, you know, when Brian Wilson did Pet Sounds, that's another one I would take with me. The Beatles said, "Oh my God, we got to do something," and then they did Sgt. Pepper, and there was this, you know. Incredible competition at a very high level. These artists not only striving to write more important music, but also using the technology that was available to them in the studio to do certain things. Brian Wilson, you know, he had his own personal problems why he couldn't perform. He didn't like touring, but put him in the studio and give him these great musicians who figured out pretty quickly that this was a genius and they were going to do what he said, and he created these worlds of beauty that were just astounding. I'll tell you, you may not want this later, I'll tell you a quick anecdote though, a Brian Wilson anecdote, which is that at a certain point he stopped touring. It was too problematic for him. He was scared to go on stage at that point. He was having problems. And so Mike Love, one of the Beach Boys, said, well, if you're not going to tour, why should we pay you your touring royalties? We're out there working and you're not. And Brian Wilson got some good advice, went to see an attorney and drew up a thing that said, okay, I won't tour, I don't get my touring royalties, you don't get to use my songs. Well, that was the end of that debate, because Mike Love, without Brian Wilson's songs, Mike Love would be unknown to us today. He would be just another surfing jerk.
So we went through, I like how we have pretty much gone through actually several generations of music.
Right.
What you talk about here in the book is the generational gap, and that's what I love, is because I guess I'm kind of a history nerd, is the generational gap between pretty much the greatest generation and the baby boomers.
That's right.
And that is breaking it down from what you wrote was the greatest generation they had when they were growing up, they had the Depression, they had, you know, they didn't have the child labor laws quite at the time, so they were working, many of them were working for a very young age because you needed money, and you were struggling as a family,
right.
And a lot of times you needed you needed another, that mouth to feed needed to be another income asset.
Right.
And then you had, on the other side of that, you had the baby boomers who were growing up in a new generation. They were at home trying to go to school and just felt compelled by this movement.
And we had leisure time. That, this whole idea of having this leisure time and having all these recreational opportunities out there for you was really unique. Remember, the word teenager didn't exist until the 1950s when it was really developed. So we were unique, and I was a product of that. And I was, compared to that other, I was a spoiled brat, not because I was a bad kid, far from it, but I think it's a really important issue. I think kids who grew up in my generation, we were given chores. My mother thought it was important for me to have things I had to do, but I resisted it. And looking back later, I knew because it was meaningless. The family didn't need me to do anything. In other words, I wasn't important. As the earlier generation, the kids had stuff they had to do to help. And now, even today, a lot of students I work with who come from families that are at or near the poverty line, those kids have jobs to do for their families, cooking or childcare or laundry or something they need to do for the family. So there became a class issue and a generational issue at that time. And my mother was a big Frank Sinatra fan. And I mentioned this in the book, that in a way, Sinatra was one of those people who called all the rock and rollers goons and who thought that rock and roll was just, stupid. Well, people said the same thing about him. And it's interesting because the way that Frank Sinatra related to my mother, the only time she ever cut school was to go see Frank Sinatra sing at the Brooklyn Paramount Theater. She and her sister snuck out of school to go see him. She was one of the Bobby Soxers. But Frank Sinatra was the most intimate of the crooner. You had gone from the Rudy Valley generation where he's singing and has to sing loud to get to the back row, and all of a sudden Sinatra has the microphone. And it's very intimate, and he is talking directly to his audience. And that was part of his power, was that each of these young girls thought that he was singing directly to them. So it was very powerful, but then when it came to rock and roll, my mother couldn't hear it. And she would say, it just sounds like noise to me. And so I would play her, and thank goodness for Leonard Bernstein. Leonard Bernstein was one of the first older generation to say, no, listen to this stuff. Some of these people, the Beatles and the guy, Michael Brown, the guy from the Left Bank, and Brian Wilson were writing wonderful music. And so I got to, all of us young kids got to use those arguments to say, no, this music has merit to it. But you can understand why the older generation couldn't hear it. The same way I have trouble hearing a lot of hip-hop or emo or a lot of the music that's popular now. I try not to dismiss it and say, well, it's just noise. But that is the first thing I can't, it's hard for me to get it. It's not made by people my age, and it's not intended for me. And if my generation loved it, the kids would move away from it. That's part of the charm of the music, is it's that, revolutionary, or at least, it's a way of kids marking their territory and their identity separate from that earlier generation. That's an important thing. But again, we didn't go through that. My generation was the first generation where that sort of, it was the one thing my generation knew, and now I think every generation is like that. When you ask kids when they're growing up, where do you want to live? They just say, I don't know, but not here. Kids, they don't want to live in their hometown. It seems boring to them. They're sure there's something more exciting over the horizon. And anyone who's younger may see this. I say, you're wrong. There's nothing more exciting than where you're from, and that is where your roots are. Which isn't to say you shouldn't go out and explore and maybe find some place that you want to put down roots, but don't feel like there's a pot of gold over the next hill, because then you're always going over the next hill and the next hill. and you're not necessarily going to find it. And at a certain point, you're going to want to look back and say, okay, where did I lose my roots? Where did I come from?
There's so many. It's funny you say that. You're talking about music, talking about country music. Country music is so inherent for saying, I'm going to leave this town. It's so inherent for doing that. I'm going to go to California and make my new way.
That's right. And that's, that's part of American, I've talked to my students a lot. Individualism is really, if you want to think about what does it mean, I ask my students, what does it mean to be an American? When we say I'm an American, what does that mean? And I don't know if there's, freedom is the one thing that students say first, but I think individualism is one of the most important features, and that is a great thing, but it means it's a move away from community. So we're individuals, and we're always looking to lift ourselves up by our bootstraps and looking to make our situation better and brand ourselves and all those things, and think for ourselves. And those are all good, except when they're not, except when we lose the ability to work with others in our community for some common good. So, in recent history, we get to this stage where people are saying, no, you will not infringe on my freedoms and tell me to wear a mask, even though telling people to wear a mask is a way of trying to prevent not only that person from getting sick, but prevent the virus from spreading. So there are ways in which, if we don't act in a communitarian way and find common ground to work towards common goals, we're in trouble. But in America, I think it's much tougher. Look, there's a reason why the Asian countries were able to beat back the virus in a way the United States isn't. And I think individualism is the answer. Now, I'm saying the United States should be like China, where they could actually lock people in their homes to prevent the spread of the virus? No, but I think they would do well to be a little more like us, and we would do well to be a little more like them when there's something as pressing as a pandemic to deal with. But it comes down to a lot of other issues as well. So that's, again, and I'll put it, the rock and roll, one of the things Marshall McLuhan talked about, it can get confusing and misleading, is talked about hot medium and cool medium. The cool medium is one that we have to supply the energy. So television, by this definition, is a cool medium because we don't have to do anything. We just sit there on the sofa, and all the sounds and all the images and all the editing and all the lighting, all those things are put together to make a product for us, and we don't have to do much. Comparatively speaking, with music or other, radio is a very intimate medium. We get this voice. We provide the pictures in our heads. So when we listen to radio, it's very intimate. There's a reason why Franklin Delano Roosevelt made great use of radio. There's a reason why Adolf Hitler made great use of radio. This is very intimate. Marshall McLuhan suggested that if television existed when Hitler was coming up, he never would have made it, because he was a small, sort of squeaky-voiced guy. He was sort of comical. I don't know about that. But, so whether we look at this stuff as that rock and roll is great because it's a hot medium in that we supply the images in our head. We decide what a song is about. In my book, I talk about music video. There's a lot of great music video out there, but I'd rather the song mean to me what the song means, and I have the images that I associate with that song in my head, as opposed to being told that, oh no, these are the images that go with that song. Now I can enjoy both, but that one is, engages my imagination more, so that means the song is going to be more meaningful to me, I think, when I'm invested in the process of deciding what it means, than if the music video tells me, oh, here's what it means, here's what's going on. That the less you're given in a medium, the less you're told what to think, the more you have to do. Reading is the best thing. We talk about as a culture, our attention span is being reduced and reduced and reduced. If you want to expand your attention span, read. You're in communion with one other voice. Whoever the author is, you're in communion with that person, and you're following their train of thought. You're entering their universe. But then it's up to you to decide what the meaning is. And so it's like a dialogue between you and that person. And it's powerful, and it's an extended dialogue. The more you read, the more extended it gets. The more you are clicking and going from platform to platform, and you're going through channel surfing, your attention span gets reduced further and further.
Well, somebody has caught on to that fact with social media. Somebody has caught on very well, because I don't know if you're familiar with TikTok.
Yeah.
It is 1 minute, it's 15-second to 1 minute videos.
Right.
Somebody has caught on to this idea very well, and they have profited greatly from it.
Well, advertising. I mean, and you have to say, we try to ask how did Donald Trump become president, and what were his skills? Was he, and one of them is he totally internalized all the language of advertising. So it's advertising's job to sort of mislead us and to get us to behave in a way that we wouldn't have otherwise.
He understood sound bites very, very well. One phrase, he knew how to speak very clearly,
that's the language of advertising.
Very easily to the American people.
You got 30 seconds. When I ran for office, they said, this is your elevator speech. You got to have a speech that between the first floor and when the person gets off the floor on the third floor, that you can say what you need to say. And when I did public relations for a number of years, after I worked for the Rock and Roll magazine, I went to work in the music industry because I wanted to make a living. And I would tell the artists I worked with when they did an interview, and I'm not a good example of it, but I would tell them, when you're asked a question, you don't have to go all the way and ponder an answer and go all the way down the rabbit hole. Know what you want to say. And I would coach them to say, it's okay to tell the interviewer, well, that's an interesting question, but what I'd really like to talk about is, so you make sure that you say the stuff that you need to convey. And when you get to a politician or someone like that, that's the training that they get, is that here are your sound bites, and you will never do an interview without repeating them, and you will say as little other than that as possible.
Well, because it's a message. So this is actually very interesting, because we go back to music. Okay, so we're talking about music and the idea. So music has there's a chorus, there's a verse, right? And as much as a rebel as either one of these politicians wants to be, or as rock and roll wants to be, they still fit the same thing. You're presenting a message, you're presenting it very clearly, and you're presenting it in a certain format. So as much as a nonconformist as you present yourself, you still fall under the same trap.
Oh, and to me, it's like any form. I make the point in the book that in some ways rock and roll was the most restrictive of forms, especially at the beginning. It was like 3 minutes was the upper limit for a song that was going to get on the radio. So you had these rock and roll artists, and until later, till the Beatles started bending it, but still, the 3-minute song remains pretty consistent form. So to try to say what you have to say within 3 minutes. I had one of my editor at Fusion magazine used to say, 20 seconds into a song, I can tell whether it's worth anything or not. I thought that was a little radical, but that was very typical of him.
Well, they probably listened to a lot of songs.
He did, but he was speaking to his own sense of his wonderful taste, but he was also that there's this form. So I do get a pretty clear indication right away, the way it's from the attack. And the way an artist comes into a song and the format, whether it's something that's going to interest me or not. But no, yeah, rock and roll is interesting because I think the Beatles actually went over. I'm not that interested in those records where they went and got much more psychedelic and they started doing these long tracks. I'm interested in it, and it was revolutionary at the time and helped open people's minds to new ways of doing things. But that's not the most enduring of their music, I don't think. I think they did better. And you can see, all as they went and made solo work, none of them did much that was experimental in that way. After that, John Lennon a little bit. So I think they all came back to, okay, here's what we do, here's what rock and roll is, and working within the form, instead of looking at being restricted, say it's the form that actually sets you free because you use these tried and true. There's a reason that, having a refrain, having a chorus, that repetition works. Again, going to advertising, repetition works. So rock and roll it's affecting your body. If you're hearing it, you don't have to listen for the song to sort of hit home with you. But then the best rock and roll is stuff that works on you in that way that you can dance to it, but also is food for thought.
It was funny. I was listening to how that came about. Actually, the chorus,
right.
And the reason was because there was a composer. I think it was Tchaikovsky, but I can't remember, where they used to not have that at all. And the thing about the chorus in that repetitive tone was it brought the listener back home. It made you feel more comfortable. It's the same reason you watch a movie over and over again. You know what's going to happen.
Right.
And you just feel more comfortable knowing what
right.
happens. You feel more comfortable coming into your home. You know where everything is.
That's right. Well, and again, talking about rock and roll, that structure, was already established to some extent with the blues, which can be very repetitive, and the call and response. I mean, gospel music really developed alongside rock and roll. People think of gospel as it must be much older. It really isn't. But that call and response that you get in gospel music is very similar to that, going back to that refrain. And a lot of rock and roll, you'll hear when you get to the chorus, more voices join in. So it's like a call and response. It's your main singer putting out the stuff, and then this chorus comes in and chimes in. So it works on all those different levels. I'll just say, when you're going back to my desert island, there'd be some Five Blind Boys of Alabama, some of that great, those quartets and quintets, that era of gospel music, the 1940s, 50s. Just beautiful stuff. I don't always agree with all the theology in all of that music, but that is powerful music. The combination of the structure and this human emotion and the striving is amazing to me.
You touched on the fact that rock and roll was concerned with the rhythm, romance, and selling records.
That's right. It was simple stuff at the beginning, and like I said, the most powerful rock and roll is still you strip down to the elements. That's one of the reasons that rap and hip hop are so powerful. What did it do? It got rid of a lot of stuff, stripped it right down to its essentials. The beat and what the artist had to say. So it's all, stripping it down to that. But rock and roll was more. What I say is, as opposed to the blues and this music that was redemptive, but also the music of suffering and trying to create something miraculous out of the suffering. It's a minor miracle that black people did in this country. But rock and roll was a product of my generation that had nothing to redeem. It was more purely joyful, in a way that shows our white privilege, that we could listen to that stuff and not, at the beginning anyway, hear that suffering that was at the bottom of that blues and rhythm and blues that rock and roll came out of. We could sort of let that go and just say, no, we're just going to dance and have fun with it. But it was there, and I think rock and roll, well, you could see the whole movement that the Beatles did and other artists did as a way of sort of reclaiming the authenticity at the base of it. That as a protest music and as a music that expresses dissatisfaction as well as joy. But that doo-wop stuff is just, again, that earlier generation of June, Moon, Spoon, Tin Pan Alley controlled, that was where sheet music controlled the music industry in the United States. And then little by little it went to, radio and went to, records and so on. But the transition to television, again, just fed on this idea that this was lightweight stuff. It was ephemeral. It was just, someone could come in the middle of a show and do you a song or two, and Ed Sullivan come on, and then they do their little rock and roll thing, and then came Topo Gigio, this talking puppet, and then came Acrobats, and it was, so you could put it, for many years, remember, black people didn't appear on television. And I use some of that analysis, that structure in my book. So black people weren't there unless you were a musician or a dancer. So you could come on TV and be appreciated for your talent, but as black people didn't exist. So that's the time I grew up. That was just beginning to change, where you would see some black faces on TV, and with it, as media changed a little bit and black voices became more prominent, we began to, and it's still happening now, and it's moving quicker now, I think for the better, is that invisible, these communities and invisible history is now being made more visible to us. And look, the beginning, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones took these Chuck Berry songs and these Bo Diddley songs and turned them into something a little else, and it was a kind of theft. They were honoring that music, they loved that music, but something was lost in the translation. And there were a lot of black artists whose songs made other people famous who never got recognized. So I think as rock and roll, over the years, rock and roll has tried to redeem itself by being more self-consciously cognizant of its roots and celebrating its roots and celebrating the various, the depths of those roots. I hope so, anyway. And a lot of the more current artists, I think, do that very consciously. Rhiannon Giddens in North Carolina and stuff, she's not a rock and roller, but she's listened to her share of rock and roll, and her band, I guess you'd say, was a rock and roll band. But now she's not looking to branch out and become more famous. She's digging deeper the other way and mining all this American roots music for the history and the meaning of it. So it's very encouraging.
You talked about the business of television and the adaptation of radio. You said the television business is not radio. It's too powerful, too vivid, too compelling to be allowed, too fun to lose, too loose. And that was from Harry Bannister. And this was sort of the change from music and the technological advances from radio to television.
Right. Well, as I said earlier, the most fun shows, when you get after Elvis. Okay, Elvis establishes very clearly, and Ed Sullivan, the purpose of his appearance in Ed Sullivan was Ed Sullivan telling the world, literally, he said, this is a fine young, there's nothing to be scared of. Elvis is a show business person, and we have nothing to fear from Elvis. But people still were afraid of the way he moved and the easy way he was with black music and black people. But you had all these markets all around the United States who were saying, wow, this is powerful, reaching these kids. Look at the way these kids are behaving. Look at the way they're coming out. We want to reach these kids. How do we do that? But how do we do it in a way that doesn't get the older folks crazy and doesn't, make all our advertisers go crazy? So they experimented, and in some cases, there were wonderful local shows in Cleveland. I think Cincinnati, if I'm not mistaken, was where Bannister was from. But so all these communities wrestled with it until ABC TV seized upon Dick Clark. And that was the whole effort, was to make something that and palatable for television. So this made for television version of rock and roll, and then all those local shows pretty much got wiped off the map. And as soon as American Bandstand started in Philadelphia, and there's a whole fascinating story about that, about Philadelphia and the school groups that came together around the bandstand before it was American Bandstand. But once it went national, once that was syndicated across the country, it really wiped all those earlier shows off the map. And this new kind of rock and roll, that was, again, Frankie Avalon and Ed Funicello, and the connection with Disney through the Mouseketeers, and this, I call it the infantilization of rock and roll, that it created this whole, that led to bubblegum music, led to this music that was, fine for 12-year-olds, but not, that's who it was designed for. And that's what American Bandstand did. But I'll just say on Dick Clark's behalf that Dick Clark was not, he was just a guy looking to get rich, and he did. But he genuinely liked his teenagers. I think he felt he was doing the teenagers a service. The same way he sold them pimple cream, he sold them a more wholesome version of rock and roll that he thought was good for them. So Dick Clark to me is not a figure of, I don't blame the guy for what happened. Television, if it weren't Dick Clark, it would have been someone else. And the same way Ed Sullivan, for the earlier generation, made it okay for Elvis to be on television. Dick Clark made it okay for rock and roll to have its own show, its own format. And then when rock and roll started getting a little more subversive, it had to go to midnight. That's when you started getting all those shows at 11 p.m. and 12 p.m. where that kind of rock and roll couldn't be on during prime time, couldn't be on the Ed Sullivan Show, or or on the afternoon after school like Dick Clark was. Had to be on after midnight.
Well, this comes to one of those things that what is acceptable for a certain generation. Right. Around that time, the I Love Lucy show, you couldn't have they couldn't be sleeping in, they were a married couple, you couldn't have them sleeping in the same bed for some reason.
Right.
But you talked about, this is one of those generational things. Elvis, he had the hip swivel, and so I was told that he can only be shot from the chest or the stomach up. You couldn't shoot his legs and that.
Well, that was the third appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show where they did that. That's famous, but the backlash, but again, it just tells you that this, it's hard for people to remember how serious the anti-rock and roll backlash was. So that was their solution.
Droned on. I'm out of breath, man.
I was gonna say, let me just, for the benefit of the camera, let me just say, I want to thank Brian. I want to thank GCTV for the opportunity, and just want to say, this is my book, and if you want to know about the history of rock and roll television from a point of view of just what happened, it's in here. A list of all the shows that were there is in here, but also an analysis of what that did to the country and so on.
That's right. But thank you so much for being on. I appreciate it.
Oh, well.
It's been fun.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. It's just,